evening, everybody, and welcome to the November 9th session of the Bellingham City Council. We have three announcements. On Monday, November 16th at 7 p.m. in the council chambers, there will be a public hearing on Bellingham's 2015-2016 mid-biennial budget modifications. On Monday, November 16th at 7 p.m. in the council chambers, there will be a public hearing to the consideration of the amendments to the Bellingham Comprehensive Plan to incorporate the Bellingham School District's new 2015-2021 Capital Facilities Plan. On Monday, November 16th, there'll be another public hearing on an ordinance amending Chapter 17.82 regarding special property tax valuations for multifamily development in urban centers. Will you please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Terry Borneman.
Here.
Dan Hamill.
Here.
Gene Knutson.
Here.
Michael Lillequist.
Here.
Roxanne Murphy.
Here.
Pinky Vargas.
Here.
Jack Weiss.
Here. Okay, tonight we have two public hearings, so what we're going to do is we're going to do the 15-minute public comment period for 15 minutes. We'll go to the public hearings, then we'll come back and finish up everybody who signed up or anybody who wishes to speak under the 15-minute public comment period. So the first three names are Dick Conboy, Ellen Lee, and Brooks Anderson. And we have a 3-minute clock right over there at Elizabeth Station, so... Not at Elizabeth Station, not Elizabeth Station up on the hill there, excuse me. Okay, go ahead, Dick.
Yeah, I got cheated out of 4 seconds here.
We'll get it.
Dick Conboy, South 46th Street here in Bellingham. I brought a different hat to wear tonight because Veterans Day is around the corner. And I'd like to talk about thanking the troops and how that comes about. A couple of years ago, I was in Bend, Oregon, and I was wearing this hat, and a lady came up to me and said, "Thank you for your service." And I said, "Oh, I appreciate the thought." And then she says, "Welcome home." And I said, "Ma'am, I came home 45 years ago." And she was a little stunned, and so was I. I probably shouldn't have said that. But what it brought up is it didn't work very well. And what do you say in these encounters? And what really is meaningful thanking our troops? You know, we have these concerts and we have parades and ceremonies and cannons fire and volleys of rifles and all that. And you go to football games and cheerleaders are there wiggling around saying, "Yay, troops." And then they start talking about the heroes. And, well, we all know that not everybody who served in the Armed Forces of the United States is a hero. So you get it gets to be a worn out term. And it really doesn't mean much. If you go into a VFW hall somewhere and ask all the heroes to stand up, you'll get some blank stares because they won't know what you're talking about. So I started thinking about what might work a little bit better if you come up with a veteran and say, "Hey, thank you for your service." You might engage them saying, you know, "What did you do? Where did you go? What was the experience like?" And also, it might be nice for you to tell them a few things, and I've made a short list here. You can tell the veteran that you participate as a citizen in government at some level, that you write to your representatives on issues of importance to you, that you discuss politics and government with your family at the dinner table, that you expose your children to the process of government at city or county council meetings, that you take your family to visit the state capitol or our nation's capital to learn how government works, that you ensure that civics and government is taught in our schools, that you take your children to historic sites and explain their significance, that you value the teaching of history and critical thinking, that you demand our nation care for the men and women it has sent off to war, and lastly, that you vote, and moreover, that you vote for men and women of peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Ellen Lee.
Ellen Lee. I'm not able to read regular print, so I brought a reader.
To Mayor Kelly Linville and City Council members, thank you for representing the residents of Whatcom County. Since 1983, our public transportation resource, WTA, has served our county as a municipal corporation. I am thankful for the helpful service that they provide. However, our society has significantly changed since 1983, and passengers are not as aware of bus etiquette and regulations as they need to be. As a result, our population of seniors and disabled people are experiencing difficulties and inconsistencies that translate into safety hazards when attempting to use our public transportation system. Drivers and passengers are either not aware of ADA regulations or think they are optional, as these hazards seem to be a regular occurrence. From not offering their seat to a senior or remaining in disabled seating when a disabled/senior person boards, to bringing on board large items that block the walkway for passengers, these are real and preventable hazards for seniors and disabled passengers. They include oversized strollers, rolling shopping carts, luggage, passenger proclaimed service dogs without official visible identification, drivers inconsistently/quietly calling out street names on the route. A good public transportation system needs to be effective for everyone. WTA needs to improve their courtesy training regarding seniors and disabled people so that all residents feel comfortable riding regular public transit. Over the past year, I've been in contact with WTA Supervisor Donna about riding the bus as a disabled rider and have spent time providing both positive and negative feedback. Donna has been very open and helpful in working on solutions, but additional hands-on training and accountability is needed for drivers and re-education for riders for real improvement to happen. The result will create a consistent, comfortable, and safe bus riding environment for all passengers. How do we improve the public transportation experience for all passengers? Talking buses are a must, covering an important ADA regulation that is currently not being followed in Whatcom County. This will provide consistency on all routes and enable drivers to better focus on their other duties. Re-education, aka the Courteous Campaign. WTA needs to organize assemblies for K through 6 in Whatcom County, teaching children about appropriate bus behavior. Provide an instructional video that middle school through college students watch before being given a bus pass. Display posters and other marketing materials featuring educational messaging at homeless shelters, food banks, and the Opportunity Council. I understand that there is a 10-member board that governs the WTA, and 2 of those members are city council members. Unfortunately, from my understanding, only 1 member regularly rides the bus. My challenge to you as city council members and the mayor is to dedicate a half day.
Could you just go to the last 2 paragraphs?
Oh,
Well,
sure.
The bottom part, please. Thank you.
You bet, thanks. Seniors and disabled people have the option of riding paratransit rather than regular WTA buses. However, there is an hour window both coming and going when the passenger is forced to wait for their ride or drop-off. This can be difficult for many, and there is no other option.
Whoop. Keep going. Go ahead.
Thank you. More needs to be done to enforce that disabled/senior seating is available immediately for those passengers. Simplify the messages on the bus walls, require bus drivers to be vigilant and act swiftly when infractions exist, and start re-educating the passengers from middle school age to college. These steps will ensure a more comfortable, respectful, and safe bus riding experience for all. Thank you for your attention and consideration, Ellen Lee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brooks Anderson and Charles Law.
Hello, and thank you, City Council and the Mayor and staff for listening to all of us tonight. I know you do a lot of listening, so I appreciate that. I want to specifically thank you, although it might be a little late, for standing firm on not accepting the sales tax jail funding. If you haven't already started talking with the county council and the county executive about a better plan for a new jail, we need a new jail. I suspect you already have, but if you haven't, please do. It's really important to our county. Oh, did I say I'm from Whatcom County? I am from Whatcom County, and my name is Brooks Anderson. So I've heard the sheriff say that he will start putting money into making the present jail work at this time. Question is, why hasn't the money been going towards making it a place where people can be safe and who are incarcerated there and also who work there before this time? Anyway, the voters said no. And I think the voters said no in part because of you taking the stand that you took and not giving up. So I really want you to know how much I appreciate that. I also want to encourage you to stop the use of pesticides and herbicides on our public lands. This is something that I've spoken about several times over the last couple of years to you and the county council, and I get the same responses. Oh, we use so little, and it really hasn't been proven that Roundup and glyphosate is dangerous. Well, there's a lot of evidence that it is. France just decided to ban it being sold in garden stores, and there's several other countries who have done that. So even if you don't know, which I've heard that from you and from the county council, why would you endanger us and the animals and our land by allowing any of it? There has got to be bravery on this, I guess, and taking a more proactive stance on this. Do not let the Public Parks Department or the Public Works Department continue to spray Roundup and other herbicides and pesticides in our drinking water and on our public lands. It's really something that's way overdue that you need to take care of. I'm sure you can. I know you will. I think that's all I want to say in the public comment. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Brooks. Charles Law, and then we're going to go to our 2 public hearings, then we'll come back to the comment.
Charles Law Watcom. After hearing all this public comment, I didn't have a chance to really present what I was going to talk about without reading it. Yesterday, I ran into Pinky Vargas walking in what some would think was a nice trail on Alabama Hill. It was anything but natural. A bike path, a doggy run, or just a plain walk from point A to point B. Hardly much of a way of nature. Nothing in the way of diversity. Oh, there were a few squirrels, I must admit. But is this what Whatcom we wish to leave to our children? A few nuts, a few squirrels. Removing biodiversity removes the wild from the landscape. We pass through as domesticated animals, removed from nature. Some would have you believe that a mountain having fewer wolves creates paradise. Although Leopold once said, I sense that neither the wolf nor the mountain agree with this view. I suspect that just as a deer herd lives in mortal fear of its wolves, so does a mountain live in fear of its deer. So also with growth. The growth man who clears his area of diversity does not realize he cannot take over the job of the wolf. He has not learned to think like a mountain. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Okay, we'll close the public hearing for now, and we're going to go on to our first public hearing. We'll be back to the public comment as soon as we're done with the 2 public hearings. The first public hearing is a public hearing on the proposed assumption of the rights, powers, function, and obligation of the Transportation Benefit District to the City of Bellingham. Mr. Henshaw.
Brian Henshaw, Finance Department. Tonight's public hearing is on the proposed assumption of the rights, powers, functions, and obligations of the Transportation Benefit District by the City of Bellingham. It's the public's opportunity to have any comments or questions regarding this. And I have one slide here. So in summary, State enacted legislation in July 2015 that allows council to assume this responsibility. The important thing to note is that there's no change in the functions or obligations of the Transportation Benefit District. It's more or less a reporting, name change, and accounting change. We will continue to report all of the transportation benefit activities as a special revenue fund. Currently, it's a discrete component fund of the city, so it's a name and accounting change. I believe that there's efficiency gains and cost savings to make this change. From an operational and management standpoint, it'll reduce the auditing fees, some of the public meetings. All of the activities will still come to council for approval. They will just be done in the normal council setting.
Okay. Is there anybody here to speak on this issue? There's one person signed up, but she already spoke under public comment, and I think she left. So is there anybody here that wants to speak on this issue? Charles, come on down.
This might pertain to that transportation issue. Recently, we spent $3.8 million on a project on Alabama Street. The WTA, the Washington State Transportation Authority, has petitioned the governor over and over and over again, saying that studded tires destroy our streets. After spending over $3 billion on a street, I would assume that after a while that street's going to be tore up again due to studded tires. They come into effect on November the 1st, and I think May the 1st is the last day you can wear those tires. But as you can see, we haven't had any snow yet, and it's, we're about in the middle of November. So if it's anything the city of Watkins can do, the city of Bellingham can do to push this forward to shorten that period, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Charles. Anybody else? Okay, seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and turn it back to council. Michael.
Just a little note or question for the staff. We also assigned the Transportation Commission to serve as an advisory body to the TBD. I don't know if there needs to be a little name change in that charter to make sure that the Transportation Commission continues to advise on what were TBD-related funding questions.
Ted's nodding his head, so Brian, you want to comment on that?
At this point, we envision that that'll still happen. They'll still make their advisory recommendations, but all of that will still come to council.
Okay. Okay, what's the council's wishes? What do we need, a motion?
Try it.
Okay.
I move that we pass the proposed assumption of the rights, powers, functions, and obligation of the Transportation Benefits District by the City of Bellingham.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will now go on to our next public hearing. Public hearing on the city's proposed update to the Critical Areas Ordinance.
Good evening, council members. I'm Rick Sepler, the Planning and Community Development Director. Tonight I'm joined by Development Services Manager Kurt Nebefeld and by planners Steve Sundin and Kim Wheel, and we'll be presenting on the Planning Commission recommendation on proposed revisions to the city's adopted Critical Area Ordinance, which is codified in our municipal code as Title 16. The Planning Commission recommendation fully incorporates staff's analysis and proposed revisions, as well as comments received from the State Department of Ecology, the agency charged with implementing critical area regulations. So in short, staff, after a dutiful analysis, presented a staff recommendation. That recommendation was vetted with state agency. The Planning Commission, after consideration, acknowledged its technical nature, but deferred to the expertise of both the state and staff and adopted a recommendation that's before you for tonight's public hearing. In 1995, the Growth Management Act, as codified in RCW 3670A, was amended to require all cities and counties that are planning consistent with the Act to include the best available science in developing policies and development regulations to protect the functions and values of critical areas. And this is very important. All counties and cities in the state are required to review, evaluate, and I'll underscore this phrase, and if necessary, revise their critical area ordinances. In essence, if you review and your critical area ordinance meets the requirements of including best available science in preparing the regulations, you've met the bar that's been set by the state legislation. The critical area ordinance is a implementing regulation. It's not a comprehensive plan element, nor is it part of the comprehensive plan. It is a policy document that implements those policies contained in the plan as tempered by law, actualized and used to amplify or modify projects as they come forward. It's much like a subdivision ordinance or other ordinances that are adopted by the city. They provide site-specific guidance. Staff did internal review on our existing critical area ordinance, and they came to the conclusion that best available science was used to develop policies and development regulations. Remember, that's the sole charge of this revision. Did you meet that test? And staff came to that conclusion. They brought forward a draft that dealt largely with procedural issues. Largely having used the critical areas ordinance for a number of years, there were a number of process-related issues, not substantive standards, that they hope to address. Concerns were raised throughout public comment at the Planning Commission level, and we take those very seriously. The Planning and Community Development Department stopped review. We stepped back to regroup and to assess the specific concerns were raised. We reached out to both state agencies as well as to organizations with expertise in the field to assess and comment, which they did, and they're part of the record, their responses. Revisions were prepared, and a review of all comments received on a point-by-point basis was initiated. I think you'll note in your packet, we actually went through, we had over 180 separate commenters on issues. We responded on point to every comment that was raised. In doing so, we crafted the ordinance that's before you today, embodied in the Planning Commission regulations and recommendation. Some will assert that we still need to do major structural revisions to the ordinance. However, in the opinion of the state agency that's charged with implementing the critical area regulations, the Department of Ecology, and the statewide public interest group, FutureWise, which gave us extensive comments, the draft before you meets or exceeds all regulatory requirements. Some will assert that public participation is deficient and there have been procedural errors. This is the process we're using now, coming before you in public hearing after public hearing with the Planning Commission, that our own code requires for amendments to the code. Remember, this is not amending the comp plan, it's amending an implementing reg. Others might state that we are not required to adopt all of Department of Ecology's recommendations. Some were folded in because we believe they provide expertise. However, it is true that the Department of Ecology does not have the overarching review, final say, on critical areas, unlike shorelines where they do. However, it's pretty clear when you have correspondence from the agency that says you will not meet best available science unless you include these points. You're opening yourself up to third-party review and challenge. And we felt we were most defensible to include them, although we differed slightly with ecology on those points itself. I think some might say that we're considering this out of sequence and that we're doing this in a piecemeal manner, that this should be considered with the comprehensive plan, although it is not a part of the plan, it's an implementing reg. This is not consistent with the direction to review and revise if necessary. Further, cities are not required by the Act, by the current matter before us, to start over, to produce additional studies or revise their land use system. The only time those actions are warranted is if in critical analysis you find that you have not been able to identify that best available science was used in developing the policies and development regulations that are included in the draft ordinance. As our Planning Commission determined, and as my colleagues will describe shortly, that is not the case before you. As revised, Bellingham has met or exceeded the requirements of including BAS, Best Available Science, in preparing its critical area ordinance. I'm going to turn this over to Steve, and he's going to walk through point by point the changes and revisions that we are proposing.
Thank you, Rick. Steve Sundin, I work in the planning department. Kim and I are going to keep the camera guy busy. We're both going to kind of go back and forth here as we move through these slides. I want to try to get through these in about 20 minutes, so that's less than 1 minute per slide. So we're going to try to be brief as we can, knowing that this might be kind of your first time really sort of getting into this. Of course, you've gone through the materials in the packet and all that, but we're going to step through it anyhow. What are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about briefly what the CAO is. We're going to talk about the purpose and scope of our update. We'll go through critical area types. We'll talk briefly about how the changes were made. Rick spoke already sort of about public comments that we heard. We'll address that a little bit more. We'll spend a little bit of time going through the key revisions, like the ones that we think are important enough for you to know. There's lots in there, but there's substantive ones that we think are, sort of the top 10, a top 10 list, if you will. And then we'll kind of conclude with compliance with the GMA and the comp plan. The CAO, I'm going to refer to it as the CAO from here on out. It's a protection document. As you can see, these things up on the top there, wetlands, frequently flooded areas, geologic hazard areas, streams, and habitat conservation areas. The CAO is intended to protect those. In the purpose statement, it does a balance. Typically, you hear planners talk about balancing goals of the GMA, goals of the comp plan, and that's sort of exhibited here in the purpose of the CAO, which is to protect functions while still allowing reasonable use of the property, public and private property. When we set out on this task in May of 2014, we identified several things that we want to do as part of this update, not an overhaul, but an update. And those things were to incorporate new references to materials that were meant to be utilized as assessed by the state, make sure that we still meet best available science. After road testing the program for nearly 10 years, we identified certain improvements that we could make, making language more clear, making processes more clear. A lot of times we heard, that just doesn't make sense, and we had nothing to say, but we know, or I understand, but we didn't have a fix-it mechanism. And so that was a big part of what we were trying to do here with this update.
Okay, you might be, I'm Kim Wheel, I'm with the Planning Department, and Steve said that we're going to go back and forth a little bit. Thank you. Is that better? All right. So you might wonder, well, how is it that we started regulating wetlands, these features we used to call swamps? And it's the Clean Water Act that was passed in the early 70s, delegated authority to the Army Corps of Engineers under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act to regulate wetlands. And then they delegated authority to Department of Ecology through our RCW 9048, the Water Pollution Control Act. So the federal government regulates wetlands, the state regulates wetlands, some of which, including isolated wetlands that the Corps doesn't regulate. And then we started regulating, the city and other jurisdictions around the state started regulating locally in 1992. We also do review wetland impacts through SEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act. In 1990 and 91, the city did a citywide inventory of boots on the ground looking for wetlands that we could map, and we'll show you those in just a moment, as the beginning of our first set of wetland regulations. And we had that regulation in place until 2005 when we adopted our first real critical area ordinance, which encompasses the other critical areas Steve just mentioned. And now here we are before you 10 years later with these changes. So what is a wetland? A wetland, all sizes and shapes, and some are not really recognizable, and others you can point right to it. But one thing they all have in common is that we use the same methodology to determine what a wetland is, and it's a wetland delineation manual. Basically, it's areas that are inundated or saturated enough time during the growing season that they develop these special biological and chemical conditions that only certain plants are adapted to. And they're important in our landscape because we have so much rain here that they do a lot of important functions, and you'll be hearing that word a lot tonight, and I'll explain what functions are shortly. They're in different classes, which is, they're called hydrogeomorphic classes, which is kind of where they are on the landscape and how they get their water. And there's 4 categories. The categories, one being the one that needs the most protection, and then 4 with a basically that provides fewer functions. But these are determined by the points that they get in the rating system and by their level of sensitivity and their difficulty to replace. So a lot of things are folded into what category they are, and then later we determine buffers widths from those categories. So some of the functions that they provide are nutrient uptake and pollutant uptake. And that's really important in our watersheds that are urbanizing. We have a lot of these in excess. Habitat is another really important function. And then a value. People might ask, well, what is a wetland value? It's what the wetland does that serves us. So protecting downstream properties by attenuating floodwaters is one of our values. As I mentioned, in the early 90s, when we went out around the whole, what was then the city limits, and started mapping wetlands, those are depicted on this little snapshot from CityIQ, our GIS layer, in the dark blue, and then the lighter blue are what we call site-specific wetland delineations. But this just kind of gives you an idea of when we look at our GIS layers, what they provide us. And so I want to go through and show you how we've built this layer to add to our database, which helps us in our comprehensive planning, our transportation planning, everything that we do. Really, we have to start with where are all these features, because we're likely going to try to avoid them. The next slide. This is just another way of looking at it, and so you can see this is the city limits and the UGA in the lighter gray, and then the dark gray is the county. We have a wonderful and rich layer of streams, so we have a lot of stream information, and over the years, this is the 1992 wetland inventory that city staff did, and then in 2003, we did a little bit more. As you can see, we started annexing properties. We were looking at the UGA. And then in 2015, yes, we did another robust study about almost 13,000 acres of wetland inventory to add to our database. And what you can see is wetlands really show up, and you'll see other features too, kind of at the edge of our city, because, where we want growth is in our urban core. That's our goal anyway. But this not only helped us find where these wetlands are, but at the same time, the inventory looked at potential mitigation sites, particularly for city projects, because the city has projects and we need mitigation areas for those. And one more point about the mitigation is that inventory looked at what we call the watershed approach, which is identifying mitigation sites that have the highest likelihood of success because they can be sustainable as they are. The site is more suitable because of soils and hydrology and whatnot. So kind of keep that in mind, because we'll come back to that concept. And then the green are the site-specific wetland delineations. Every single project that comes in to the city planning department that has a wetland, we get that surveyed wetland delineation and we map it. So we have a really good knowledge base of where those are.
Frequently flooded areas is another critical area type, and these are areas that are within the FEMA 100-year floodplain, and those are typically found on our bigger creeks like Chuckanut and Squalicum, most notably, like Padden Creek. And then we also have this other clause in this section that allows for frequently flooded areas to be determined by the Public Works Director. There's a process by which that is done, but essentially these are another critical area type that we protect. And this isn't the greatest map, but what it shows is the golf course and the mall. And Baker and Spring Creek, which is in purple as it moves up through the middle of the site. You can see over in the bottom right-hand corner there's a lavender. That's floodplain. That's back in the old days when it was okay to do that. Nowadays we have different rules in place where that is less achievable. Geohazard areas are basically, just think of them as steep slopes. They're handled a little differently than wetlands and streams in that you can develop within them. It just requires a certain level of engineering or geotechnical engineering or reporting. And this is just an example of those. This is Seaholm Hill, and red is really steep, and orange, I guess it is less steep. And the yellow shaded color there is the lowest steepness by which we still apply the CAO for development in those areas. Obviously on Seaholm Hill we don't have to worry about that, but we just wanted to show you what those look like, where those are.
So we've talked about wetlands and geohazard areas, and then a third type of critical area is what we call Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas, or HCAs, or streams, stream buffers, wildlife habitat. So this is the area in the code that covers stream protection and stream buffers. It also has a whole list of things that qualify, such as lands that connect habitat blocks. So some of those areas that you saw, well, we're going to show you, I'm going to show you a little bit more, but those areas around the perimeter of the city, we'll start to see how those connect with areas outside our city. Priority habitats and species, that's a list that the Department of Fish and Wildlife publishes, and we look to that for any species, whether it's bird or amphibian or what have you, or mammal. It's on that list. This ordinance offers protection to that. And some examples of habitats, priority habitats and species include mature forests, the heron colony at Post Point, and bald eagles. Bald eagles were delisted from the Endangered Species Act in 2008, but they're still protected by federal regulations, and we have management recommendations in our code. It's another picture of our heron colony. It's a recent photo. And then just this last couple of years, I don't know how much you've been briefed on the Habitat Restoration Technical Assessment, but the city embarked on this great project, first of its kind really for the city, to compile habitat data and to analyze habitat functions in 4 different habitat groups: forests, meadows, streams, and wetlands. And this is just one of the maps. You won't be able to see details here, but what it shows is habitat blocks that are at least 5 acres or greater, and where the patterns are, where you're seeing them in our stream corridors around the perimeter of our city. And it's just adding to those rich layers of data we have on wetlands and habitat types. The next slide shows meadow habitat blocks, and those are, again, kind of on the outskirts of the city.
Okay, so how do we get to the changes? How are they made? The Department of Ecology publishes guidance essentially on what materials to utilize to be consistent with best available science. Because we were doing an update, not an overhaul or a rewrite, we relied on that guidance. That's what it's there for, is to be able to be utilized by city staff, county staff. We assembled technical advisory groups. We didn't invite everyone to those, but we did invite people that we felt would be helpful for this update based upon the size of our scope. We had a geologist focus group. We had a wetland biologist focus group. We also drew from individuals that come across and inquire and do business with us normally, regularly as far as permits are concerned. And we also assembled a group of city staff who design and propose capital projects that come into contact with the CAO and some of the requirements. And so we utilize them to help us clarify language and look at ways we can streamline or make more efficient our review. As Rick mentioned on the side, we coordinated with DOE and FutureWise after the initial public hearing at Planning Commission. We spent some time meeting with them face to face, going through their concerns, proposing language that we felt like would address their concerns, and those are brought forward in the Planning Commission recommendation of the CAO. As I said, we utilize a variety of city staff, other departments, et cetera, and then we utilized the public process, which was basically 2 public hearings and a work session. We never intended that we get through it in one night. We don't intend that tonight, but we did intend that we would receive comment and that we would have the opportunity to respond to those comments through the use of the comment tracker. It's provided in your packet, where we went through and sort of itemized our responses to each of the concerns. If we made changes, we talked about where those occur in the CAO. Public comments, we received a wide range of comments like you'd expect for something like this. Rick touched on some of these things. The comments addressed our scope and that it perhaps was inappropriate, and we felt like what we were doing was an update. We were just trying to make clarification changes that made language more clear, that realized certain efficiencies, of course, to incorporate best available science. The SEPA step, there were some comments about that, and we extended the SEPA comment period longer than we usually do. We also went back and performed a SEPA step after we had made changes to the document based upon public comment and agency comment. Some felt that the public process wasn't adequate. As I mentioned, we fully intended the initial public hearing to be the opportunity where we would get to hear from people. We had already heard from our technical advisory groups. We fully expected that the Planning Commission process was how we would hear from the general public. There was mention about doing a habitat or ecosystem baseline or an inventory or a full assessment of our existing critical areas to determine if we were meeting the no net loss standard. And that's not a requirement to do that. That's a requirement for communities who are updating their shoreline programs. That's specific. As part of that process, we went through that, as you might recall, for several years, back in 2011 and 12. As Kim mentioned, we have quite a bit of existing information that we draw from as development projects come forward. Our response to these comments were that we are meant to make sure that applicants demonstrate that their projects, each project as it comes across, meets no net loss, and that's how we establish that objective. Customer service and lean, we had, in the beginning, at the time of Planning Commission, we had talked about how we were using lean concepts to make it simpler for small, insignificant projects to receive critical area review and approval. The system currently is somewhat burdensome, maybe even overbearing, and so we use our technical groups to identify ways where we might lessen the cost. To put it another way, we had small projects that the permitting was costing more than the project itself, and we felt like that was inappropriate. And so we went through a process to identify those things. We did meet with DOE and FutureWise, as I've said. I'll just move on. Quickly, we're running out of time because I said 20 minutes, so I just want to move through sort of the notable revisions that we made. And we just organized these by sections as you move through the CAO. They kind of go sequentially. We've created, instead of exemptions, we created minor critical area permits for small projects. It was confusing to people to talk about exemptions. They felt like they didn't need anything from us when in fact they actually needed a bunch of different things. We created a new section for essential public facilities. We added some things that should be reviewed over the counter, most notably wetland delineations. Folks were required to come in, and wetland biologists were required to come in and provide paperwork, permit fees, and some reporting for things that they have to do to provide a report for permitting anyways. And so we added some things that people can just have reviewed over the counter that are very insignificant. Nonconformity had some things that needed to be clarified. Get into some examples. The hatched area in the middle of your screen is just an addition to a house. Instead of that being exemption, now it's a minor critical area permit. We've lessened the requirements for this. As you can see, there's a steep slope across the bottom of the screen. And the permitting and the reporting information that is required for this type of project where the site is completely built out and there is no impact were too much. And so we've lessened those. Exemptions, we have super minor things that now we're just doing over-the-counter review, or we're proposing to do is just over-the-counter review. Nonconformity had a bunch of different challenges. Most notably, it just said that if you have something where it shouldn't be, i.e. in a buffer, and you wanted to do more there, up to 5,000 square feet, it was permitted. And we didn't feel like that was really being very protective. It also didn't make a lot of sense, so we clarified some of those sections to lessen the amount that you can do when you're already non-conforming. I've already talked about this a little bit. The cost of permitting and the reporting necessary was more than a project to add a deck or a patio or a roof eave, things like that.
All right, Steve has gone over some of the main clarifications that we were proposing, and these two bullets show two of the updates that the state is asking us to do. And so kind of the meat and potatoes of what we do with wetlands is based on the rating system. And the state has asked all of us jurisdictions to update our codes to reflect what we call the 2014 wetland rating system. And it's updating one that's about 10 years old. What they did, and what's great about Department of Ecology, is they continue to do research on the guidance that they provide us. So this reflects, hey, we studied what we've been doing. Wetland rating system is kind of a quick assessment of how functions are performing in a wetland, and we've learned some things from the last 10 years, and we're updating it and providing this new best available science. And so we're proposing to update our code with this. It has a different numbering system, a point system, but it's real transferable. So you'll see some points in there. Now they're from 9 to 27 for functional scores, which doesn't mean too much to you probably, but what's most important is that the system collects a lot more data that's based on scientific research as far as methodology. The other one is that we didn't propose this in the beginning. It wasn't part of our scope, but we do presently, wetlands that are Category 3 and Category 4, the lower functioning wetlands, are not regulated by our code if they're less than 4,000 square feet. They're isolated. They meet a couple of different criteria. The State Department of Ecology said that best available science doesn't say that size alone is a determinant of how well a wetland functions or doesn't. And there's no science that supports exempting wetlands based on size. So they repeatedly told us that to meet best available science that we would need to change this part of the code. And so what we're showing in the code now is exactly verbatim what they have proposed, and that is not exempting any wetlands in the city from regulation, but for wetlands that are Category 3 and 4 that are isolated and are under 1,000 square feet, they don't have to have buffers, and they don't have to go through what's called mitigation sequencing, which is a process by which you first try to avoid impacts. You might ask, well, what kind of difference will this make on the landscape? I just want to let you know that all wetlands are regulated by either the Army Corps of Engineers or Department of Ecology. So these wetlands that haven't been regulated by the CAO have always been regulated by these other agencies and mitigation required. So it will mean that some of the smaller wetlands that might have been exempted will now need a city permit. Some other updates and clarifications. We are just updating our wetland delineation manual title. We had an older one referenced in there. And if you don't say as amended, you know, you need to update. So although everyone's using the same manual, and so we're good there. We clarified what's allowed in a wetland buffer. It hadn't been clear before that there are certain activities. The only activity that's prohibited is actual stormwater facilities. That's the only activity that's outright prohibited. Others can be proposed. And then we clarified for both wetland buffers and stream buffers that if there are impacts that are unavoidable to the buffer, that there's a 1-to-1 ratio replacement ratio, excuse me. And then of the options for mitigation for wetland impacts, you can do creation or rehabilitation. We also are offering preservation. It's always been in the code, but we gave it a little bit more definition. And that would be for wetlands that, for example, the city really has they are highly functioning. Maybe they're identified in the Habitat Restoration Technical Assessment, and we really want to preserve those. There's an option for preservation. The Wetland Mitigation Bank you've probably heard about, and I'll show you a photo in just a moment. We clarified language about how to go about that. What's the criteria that you need to prove to be able to use a mitigation bank? Because we've been getting more inquiries. We've had a couple of projects use the bank, and the Army Corps of Engineers is encouraging their applicants to use the bank. So we've added language based on guidance we got from DOE, and we also changed the mitigation ratios in our mitigation ratio table. There were a few, not many, that were slightly lower than the Department of Ecology guidance. When I say guidance, there's a list of documents we used in our best available science list. And one of them is guidance for small cities. That's a specific document. And we went back to that this time for some of these updates. One more thing is we added another method for determining, it's an alternative for determining mitigation ratios, and it's called the credit debit method. So this is the Lummi Nation Wetland and Habitat Mitigation Bank, and one of the many notable things about it is it's the first Native American mitigation bank in the country, and it started in 2012. And these are some of the sites that if mitigation occurs, so an applicant would buy credits there, these are the locations where it would occur. So just to kind of give you a sense of where that Phase 1A is, in the lower right corner, just above there is Marine Drive. And just to the right or to the east is the city of Bellingham. It's about, let's see, how many acres? It's about 2,000 acres, the whole Lummi Mitigation Bank, with an additional total about 2,700 acres. There's been some other areas that have been restored that aren't part of the bank, but it's a very ecologically rich area. It's being developed over time, meaning that there's wetlands out there that were degraded that are being restored and providing a lot more function, and so it's available for mitigation needs.
Real quick on geohazard sections, we utilized our geotechnical group, and we had references to old hand-drawn maps that identified where steep slopes were from pre-91, essentially. And we decided that we wouldn't use those anymore because we have more up-to-date information. So that's basically what this slide says. And then the other thing that you're not going to see, because this is a procedural thing, but for geohazard areas, we want to do the review for projects on steep slopes simultaneous with building permits. So that shortens the timeline by which someone has to wait for a permit on these types of critical areas.
You'll see comments in the comment tracker about wildlife and wildlife habitat, and I think what we've tried to show you tonight is how this CAO helps protect that. We do have bald eagles in the city limits, and we have had to issue permits for projects in bald eagle habitat. So we've updated the protection in there, taking out Department of Fish and Wildlife that no longer regulates that and adding the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, actually I didn't on the streams, we've clarified what standards are for stream buffers. The standard for a wetland and a stream buffer is that a buffer is an area that is densely vegetated with native vegetation. And if it isn't that way, then it has to be restored to that to actually provide protection for the feature, whether stream or wetland. Again, clarifying mitigation ratios, and we removed those features such as eelgrass and kelp beds that are regulated by the Shoreline Master Program. They're now taken apart. And in the section 500, the last section of the CAO, we changed the definition of mature forest or wetland to match the state's definition. The 2005 CAO had a definition that somebody made up. And that, I don't mean to be trivial about it, but it really wasn't based on state guidance, and it was inconsistent with every other definition. So we would like to propose that consistency. And then we changed the stream typing nomenclature, which is right now types 1 through 5, to the letter system, which designates whether it's supports fish, or it's seasonal, or it's perennial, and so on. So we're going to match the state nomenclature now. And vesting, critical area permits used to be valid for 2 years, whereas many of our land use decisions are valid for 5. So there's some inconsistencies there, and confusion, and extra costs for applicants that weren't necessary. So we're proposing changes in BMC 21 so that all critical area permits are good for 5 years, and that matches the lifespan of a critical area report anyway, so it seems to be a good match. And we've talked about Growth Management Act and the goals about protecting critical areas and how it requires us to adopt regulations, which we've had in place since 2005. And in addition, this, as Rick said, implements our comp plan goals and policies. We have many goals and policies in the environment chapter about protecting critical areas, and the CIO implements those goals and policies. And by adopting it, we can ensure compliance with those very things that we've been talking about tonight, and we increase protection of critical areas by our clarifications and updates. We have DOE support, and we think it's much more clear and predictable for our users. And that is our presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll open up the public hearing. We'll get the 3-minute clock going again, Elizabeth, and I'll read the first 3 names. Brooks Anderson, Wendy Harris, and Wendy Stephenson. Go ahead, Brooks.
Brooks Anderson, Whatcom County. I'm kind of overwhelmed by all this information that the staff has presented. I don't think I have a comment at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. Wendy Harris. It says 12 minutes, Elizabeth.
I can use
I know Wendy would like to use 12 minutes. That was quick.
Wendy Harris.
Okay.
Wendy Harris. I'm asking the City Council not to approve this draft of the critical area ordinance until the staff can come forward and establish that it meets its primary function, which is to protect the functions and values of the ecosystem of impacted critical areas. And it can't show us that. And we know that because 10 years ago, the city first enacted its critical area ordinance, and it had the same goal then, which it has now. And first, we're given a purpose which is not correct. We're being told there's a balance test involved in this. No, there isn't. And I'm going to quote from one of the WACs. That's one of the administrative code sections based on the GMA, which says development regulations may not allow a net loss of functions and values of the ecosystems that includes the impacted or lost critical areas. WAC 360, 196, 830. There's no balancing test there. So when the city enacted their critical area 10 years ago, they were supposed to protect functions and values. And here we are 10 years later. Can they show us that they protected functions and values? They've actually taken this incredible position that we don't have to prove anything. We don't have to measure anything. Where does that work that you have laws that you have no obligation to produce evidence to show that they're working and performing? And this is a performance test. It's based on performance standards. The Western Board, the hearings board, described the GMA as imposing a duty on local governments to adopt development regulations that protect critical areas. Inherent in that duty is a requirement that the regulations contain appropriate and specific criteria and standards to ensure protection. So the city has an obligation to show how they're protecting functions and values. And how do you do that without a baseline standard, without some type of measurement or monitoring in place? Now, it's true that I can't impose on the city or tell the city to follow any specific methodology. The city's free to come up with whatever it wants. But make no doubt, if you don't have a baseline standard of function that you're measuring, you have no idea if you're protecting functions and values. And I think that's a very basic fact that we can't get over, and I want to know why we keep fighting about this. And when I look at the critical area ordinance that's been drafted, you're looking at an ordinance that is actually providing less protection than the ordinance that exists. And considering the fact that they can't establish that we're already meeting our requirements for the standards in place, that should not be permitted to occur. And I'm extremely frustrated that I have 3 minutes to talk. And I would like to say responding to extensive comment that's submitted is not the same thing as providing meaningful, intelligent comment and response. Thank you.
Wendy Stephenson.
I want my seconds back. It's already.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Wendy.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to comment on the City of Bellingham CAO. My name is Wendy Stephenson. I'm North Sound Baker with Resources. And I'm going to paraphrase Mary Christina Wood here. Some of you may have seen her last Thursday. She's an attorney with the University of Oregon. Paraphrased, we are losing the war to protect the world that sustains us. Our laws and agencies are failing us because they rely on statutory laws, such as the Critical Areas Ordinance. This is basically a very prescriptive manner where we check off boxes, but we don't consider our actions taken together or take the far view. We need to consider the public trust. The wetlands and streams should be protected to provide clean water, flood control, and harvestable fish for the benefit of us, for our sons and daughters, and for the next generations. I'm asking you guys to take the far view. I believe the far view tells us that we need a comprehensive means of assessing whether we're on the right track. We need a baseline from which to measure our gains and losses, and this accounting of how we are doing should be updated on a regular basis. I'm also going to offer a few other comments. So in current wetland guidance from Ecology, they define category wetlands. There's a number of ways they define them, but what they say about them is we cannot afford the risk of any degradation to these wetlands because their functions and values are too difficult to replace. Yet, we have mitigation ratios for these wetlands. So I would ask that we remove the ability to impact Category 1 wetlands. Number two, it's not clear that temporal loss is considered in mitigation ratios. I would like temporal loss to be included. Number three, our mitigation reports we only do those every 5 years, or for up to 5 years, in order to determine whether we have a net loss. The city assumes that if something is working after 5 years, it's going to work in perpetuity. We don't know that. I mean, there could be filling of the wetland. There could also be infiltration by invasive weed species. We need to start measuring our wetlands for longer than 5 years to really know whether or not there's a net loss or not. And there are a number of different ways we can do that. Number 4, there is a requirement to assess cumulative impacts, but this is being done on a case-by-case basis, parcel by parcel. In my view, cumulative impacts are not case-by-case. I'm suggesting that the city should undertake cumulative impacts analysis, which is needed per the code, on a watershed basis, and do that on a rolling basis every 2 to 5 years in different watersheds. The city should also author an annual report on the status of mitigation projects so that we can assess for ourselves whether the CAO is working. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. Linda Twitchell.
Linda Twitchell with the Building Industry Association. Our primary concern with what's being proposed here is 16.55.270, which is the exemption for what is now being called isolated small wetlands, Category 3 and 4. Category 3 and 4 are considered secondary wetlands. 4, for instance, is an area that may have been cleared before, that may have had serious work done to it previously. Originally, as I understand it, the city had an exemption of 1 acre for these things. In recent years, it's been 4,000 square feet. The paperwork in front of you now talks about going down to 1,000 square feet and requiring mitigation. This is, in fact, coming from the Department of Ecology, as explained earlier. They have a 2012 document called the Critical Areas Guidance for Small Cities, a document intended to give out suggested wording to cities that are small enough they don't have staff to come up with their own best available science, etc. The problems we see with dropping this exemption for we're talking about isolated Category 3 and 4, dropping this from 4,000 to 1,000 square feet. In previous testimony, the planning staff has said, we don't think this is going to stop building. It's just going to require an additional permit and more money. That's the problem. It's going to require an additional permit and more money. Right now, the permit we're talking about is, as I understand it, about $1,300. If you have a Category 3 wetland and you can't avoid it, you want to mitigate using the Lummi Bank, we're talking about for 1,000 square feet, $870. So we're talking here about potentially adding a cost of $8,000 to building a home. Homes in this area, as we have discussed before, are now the 4th most expensive in the state. Our median home price right at the moment is $325,000. I would seriously suggest that affordability, and I don't mean subsidized housing, I mean houses you can afford, that the general people can afford, needs to become a concern. So if we could avoid the requirement for mitigation and the fee and retain the exemption we have now, that would certainly work in favor of better housing affordability. The other issue here is that we're accepting the DOE's proposed language because it's supposed to be based on best available science, which says all wetlands, regardless of size, need to be maintained. But we're allowing mitigation. We're allowing you to pay money into the Lummi Bank, possibly in a completely different watershed. My question would be, if you're going to require mitigation, please ask yourselves, how does this give you an environmental gain regarding the small wetlands that we are theoretically supposed to be protecting? Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Anybody else wishing to speak on the Critical Areas Ordinance at this time?
Charles Law again. I'm tending to disagree with staff in regards to stating that the DOE and FutureWise is driving this measure. As I read, I believe it's the Department of Commerce, whose growth management programs run contradictory to basic science and goes against the first principle of survival of the earth. Pursuing limitless growth on a finite planet is a recipe for ecological and humanitarian catastrophe. It is better to limit growth by design than by disaster. In complying with this ordinance, with such rules and regulations, we are attempting to separate economic growth from its ecological impact.
Thank you, Charles.
My name is Joy Gilfillan, and I haven't been following this to the depth that I can give a lot of small detail feedback. But I am deeply concerned when I hear that it sounds to me like what we're doing is we're trying to just meet state laws and meet regulations, and it doesn't sound like we're really looking at visionary results or that we're looking at the net cost or the net loss. So I don't know what state you're in as far as how do you establish measurements for the future? How do we establish standards so that we make sure that we do take care of our critical areas? I agree with those who are deeply concerned about the destruction of the wetlands, and I have watched a lot of destruction of wetlands in our community, and I would really endorse whatever you can do to work towards the future of our economy and our ecology together. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Anybody else? Okay, seeing none, close the public hearing. Turn it back to council. Oh, yeah, that's true. Okay. This will be going to, which committee? Your committee? Planning committee? Well, that's a possibility. Why don't we do that? Well, yeah, I probably would go to the planning committee. Okay. Okay, that's where we'll send it. We'll send it to the planning committee for further discussion. Then you guys can respond to what you've heard here tonight. Okay, thank you, everybody. We're now going to go back to the 15-minute public comment period. We'll begin. The next person is Everett Barton. And for those of you that haven't signed up, I will be calling anybody that hasn't spoken, so don't worry about that. Everett Barton, is he still here? Right, go ahead, sir.
Everett Barton, Bellingham District 1, Puget neighborhood. I just want to encourage, just to sound out from the election, which passed rather quickly and almost unnoticeably, especially if you're reading the Herald. And I want to issue a call to progress for the City Council, and kudos to you for being the ocean anchor to help defeat the increase in the sales tax. And it seems that it's common sense that even though we have a county building and a county courthouse, that's really Bellingham's jail. And there ought to be some way, speaking with common sense, of allocating the money to renovate that jail for Bellingham's jail, and even putting something in the hole right here and tunneling under the roadway to make a facility. That's just speculation, of course, but I just want to encourage you to think creatively and work out a way where we can provide a nice facility right here with the courthouse, even though it's a county building, even though the facade needs to be changed, and we can include the facade changing along with the renovation of the jail. And it's going to involve a logistical nightmare for the sheriff and his men to move people out and in and whatever. But I think if we just put our thinking caps on and roll up our sleeves, we can come up with a good solution. I don't know all the ins and outs of how the money flows so that this can be provided, but just common sense would say that this ought to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Stony Bird? Okay. Blaine Anlicker? Okay. Betsy Pernado?
Betsy left.
Dr. Greg Stern, I know he's here.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Greg Stern, family medicine and public health physician, and I serve as the Whatcom County Health Officer. And I'm speaking in support of the proposed ordinance to amend Chapter 8.16 of the Code on smoking in public places to include parks and trails and to include electronic smoking devices. We've made great progress in reducing smoking among adults and youth over the past couple of decades. Educational campaigns are necessary but not sufficient. Restricting access to cigarettes for minors, restricting advertising and promotion, raising cigarette taxes, prohibiting indoor smoking in public places, and offering help to quit smoking all have served to control tobacco use initiation and ongoing use. It's clear that the use of tobacco is a major health hazard and that secondhand exposure to tobacco smoke is also harmful. You're being asked to prohibit outdoor smoking on your properties, as Peace Health St. Joseph Medical Center did many years ago. This doesn't so much limit the direct exposure to tobacco smoke, but it promotes health by making tobacco use the exception rather than the rule. Besides providing an incentive for smoking cessation and its inconvenience to smokers, it supports a new norm. Children and adolescents see that the more restricted the places are that one can smoke, the less acceptable it is. One of the features of the proposed ordinance is the inclusion of e-cigarettes and other electronic nicotine delivery systems in smoking prohibition. These products are not regulated. They have a variety of untested components, and there's little data on their health effects, and especially on the effects of secondhand exposure. However, although these devices do not involve tobacco combustion, like smoking, they do deliver nicotine, which affects the development of the developing brains of children and adolescents, and they increase the risk of vascular disease. In addition, the byproducts of vaporization are not benign. Flavorings that are considered generally safe for swallowing have not been tested for their safety when they're heated and inhaled, and some of the vaporization products are carcinogenic. If we make an exception to these devices from smoking restrictions, we risk undermining our efforts to stop children from starting the use of tobacco and nicotine. We restrict the use of other legal substances in public places, like prohibiting alcohol and marijuana in their use in public. So we have precedent that supports doing the same for e-cigarettes. The devices are attractive. They use flavorings that are prohibited from use in cigarettes, and their marketing is attractive to youth. They look cool. We can use this ordinance to make them less cool.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks.
Todd Sheehan? Take a sledgehammer to that damn clock.
I've not done this before, so. Dear council members, out of respect for everyone's time, I've written down the comments, if you don't mind me reading. My brother and I own and operate a small family business in Bellingham for the last 14 years. As business owners, we hesitated to come here because we don't want to be seen as anti-labor. We love our employees, which is funny because we're the very ones that provide a lot of the jobs. We provide approximately 40 part-time and full-time jobs year-round. The last time we ran an ad for one part-time job starting at minimum wage, I'm going to show you the applications that were filled out in person at our business. This is so that's one 3-day-a-week part-time job. and they had to come down and fill it out. That's not off the internet. Half the applicants were students needing part-time work. And one of the questions we ask them during the interviewing process is, what are you financially responsible for? And these kids, besides student loans, they're responsible for everything. And half were non-students who were actually looking for full-time work, but would settle for anything because they cannot find the work. This is living proof that we need more small businesses that provide entry-level jobs in Bellingham. The complaint I hear from fellow business owners is that Bellingham is already a very expensive place to try and survive as a business, and that the city has not been pro-job. The reason we're here tonight is to voice our concerns about the current initiative about mandatory sick leave. Not so much for that, but because it's been proven to be a precursor to the $15 minimum wage. And I can tell you that as a small business, all of our expenses are fixed, including taxes and utilities, except for payroll, advertising, and maintenance. If our payroll goes over 35% of our revenue, we have to cut jobs. And we just cut 2 full-time jobs. We know that entry-level government jobs are also going to have to go up, which means cutting other public programs to have to pay for them and raising taxes on everyone. I can tell you that in talking with other small business owners, if costs increase and the minimum wage goes to 15, they will need to raise prices or relocate to nearby areas that don't mandate it. But if they're a storefront like us and can't move, they will close if they can't make it. If you think small businesses have a lot of extra income, ask yourself why the owners are always in there working if they could afford to hire a manager. Raising prices is also a poor option when we're trying to compete with national chains with economies of scale and fighting online retailers like Amazon. Because our community lacks jobs, I think our officials should focus on how to create an environment that creates more jobs, not less. As labor becomes less available, businesses will naturally have to pay more for those employees with earned experience. That is letting the supply and demand of the job market naturally dictate pay. In closing, we just found out about the initiative on Friday for mandatory sick leave, and when we called over 30 fellow business owners, none of them were aware this was happening, and were shocked because we're not in the same job market as Seattle. I think that at the very least, small business should be made aware and given time for logical discussion before the city puts a bunch of us out of business, shrinking the much-needed job market.
Thank you, sir. Your time is up.
Okay, cool.
Okay, Joy Gilfillan's down again. Is she still here? Here she is.
I want to thank this council. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time to deeply look into the incarceration issues and the problems that we have. And I want to thank Kelly for taking the time to truly look at what could we do in Whatcom County rather than build that huge jail. And I want to really appreciate you guys took a lot of heat and you held up, and now you got a mess. I mean, I get it, but we have to do the work to clean it up. And what Scott, which one are you, Scott? That's your Todd. What Todd was talking about was small free enterprise businesses and the difficulties we have. We are probably facing one of the most difficult economic times for small businesses, and building these huge jails doesn't work. Restorative economics is a solution. I would really love to have an opportunity to bring to you the booklet that we wrote that was talking about restorative economic alternatives. The Restore a Life Center, downsizing our costs of government so that we can upsize jobs, small jobs, do trades. We're going to have to reinvent a lot of things, and I would really ask that we have an opportunity to bring to you that restorative economics booklet and talk with you about how we can do a Restore a Life Center, how we can do sustainable farms and put people to work while downsizing our economy in Whatcom County. We have a lot of work to do, and I thank you for standing up.
Thank you, Joy. Anybody else who wishes to speak in the public comment, come on down.
Hello, Eric Scott from Birchwood Neighborhood, 2933 McLeod Road. And
Hang on a second, Eric. She's going to get the clock fixed, or I'll keep it up here. I'll just keep it up here. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I'm here to represent the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board tonight in support of a smoking ban on public parks and areas. We were asked to talk about this and provide feedback, and majority of us agreed that it would be a good thing. So but we definitely had some concerns about it. I'm going to read a letter as much as I can in 3 minutes. The PRAB was concerned about health and public safety issues associated with smoking, secondhand smoke in city parks, trails, and open space. We all agree that public health and safety are paramount, and smoking does not contribute to the quality of life that citizens receive from parks, trails, and open space. In our discussion, we agreed with much of what the proposal would do, what it talked about as it was presented, although we had some reservations about how the ordinance would be implemented. The first thing was that it would provide or put additional burden on the police. We didn't want that. We didn't want the police to roll their eyes at this and feel that it was a burden to try to implement or enforce a difficult ordinance. So we didn't want a burden on the police in that regard. Also, some felt that this was an overreach of government. We talked about how it would be infringing on personal liberties. We didn't want it to be seen as trying to control personal behavior or bad habits. So we thought the smoking ordinance should be written or worded so that to be very clear that it was a concern for public health and potential fire hazard, especially in the dry season. We had a very dry summer this year. And litter. We were shown a photograph of a whole lot of cigarette butts in a city park, and that was pretty bad, indicative of something that was broken that needed to be fixed. The other concern we had was signage. We were concerned that it would be increasing sign pollution, the idea of just too many signs, too many rules, too many no signs. Being presented with a large billboard of restrictions is unwelcoming even to a non-smoker or someone who's not going to be doing any of those up there. So we wanted the signs to be not be loud, not be large, perhaps small, brown, informative type signs, either laminated metal or wood, not blaring, and also stated as asking versus telling, so please do not smoke, appreciate if you not smoke. It puts a much different feel on the park versus blatantly saying no. In summary, we do support that proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else?
Good evening. Irene Morgan, founder of the Restorative Community Coalition. I too would like to thank you all for your courage and your determination in standing up for what you believe in as far as jail is concerned. I just really appreciate how you've made your stand. I believe that Bellingham has a great opportunity here to respect your citizens to plan for a jail that is more appropriate, that includes alternatives to incarceration, and allowing for better public safety. We at the Restorative Community Coalition were told that it was a done deal and that we should stand down and not oppose jail. We did oppose it, and look what happened. It didn't pass the tax. So what else can we do with positive programs that support folks and are implemented? What else can we do in this community? I'd like to invite you and the public to our Wednesday night, November 18 meeting at Garden Street Methodist Church at 5:30 to share your ideas and your concerns and how we might do this differently in our community. And to, as Joy spoke earlier about restorative economics, we have a lot of ideas, and we ask you to come and share your ideas with us. And you've heard me say this before, I have great hope for our future. When we, visionaries in this community, and we have many wonderful nonprofits and many wonderful organizations here in our community that do awesome work, what else can we do? I think that's the biggest question that we can ask each other. What are your dreams? And Ken Mann from the County Council asked us to share our dreams and our expectations for our community with him. So let's see what we can do together. We have great opportunities in the opposing this jail tax. Thanks so much. Onward.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Hi. I'm Tom May, 137 South Forest Street.
Tom, get closer to the microphone so we can hear you.
Okay, I'm just following the instructions that said don't mess with the thing.
Well, just get closer to it.
All right, how's that?
That's better.
Can all hear me? Woohoo! All right, I am in favor of the smoking ban. I was totally excited to hear it because 12 years ago, my wife and I, we moved our family from Seattle to Bellingham with no job or anything. We moved here, you know why? Because Bellingham has some of the cleanest air in the country, said the EPA. And it's, you know what, tied with Fargo, North Dakota. It's like, no contest. So moved to Bellingham. My wife has asthma, my son has asthma. And moving from here to Seattle, my son, who was 3 years old at the time, he went from having to use his inhaler a couple times a week to a couple times a year. So it was a really, really big payoff. But going to the parks and things like that, it was just really, I could not believe, people are running roughshod over my family's health by smoking and whatever. And, I try to go to the park with my kids, and it's not a healthy place for them. So I was so excited to hear about the smoking ban, and I'm so in favor of it. And thank you. I hope it passes.
Thank you very much. Anybody else wishing to speak? Okay, thank you very much for the public comment. And I want to make a comment about the comment that was made about using the clock. Folks, I want to tell you, we've already had an hour of public testimony, whether it be the public hearing or the just public comment time. We had over 25 to 30 people signed up. There is no other fair way to do it than to do it this way. You cannot have somebody get up there and speak for 45 minutes and everybody else have no time to speak. The staff presentation, we have to have the staff presentation to know what's going on, to get all the information we need. So I don't want people to think they're being cut off, but the only fair way to do this is to have a 3-minute comment period and a three-minute time limit. And I don't know any other way to do it. So I just want everybody gets treated the same way. So that's. We will now move on to our committee reports. And the first one is Parks and Rec, chaired by Roxanne Murphy. Or do you want to, I'm sorry, it's chaired by, why don't we just take a couple-minute break, then we'll come back and finish up. order, and we will now go to our afternoon session. And the first one is planning, and the chair is Jack Weiss.
Thank you, Gene. This morning we had one item to discuss. It was the consideration of the East Bakerview Road and Mount Baker Highway annexation, consisting of approximately 163.5 acres located in the city's northern urban growth area. 2 weeks ago, on October 26th, we had a public hearing to discuss the annexation request. Today we had a work session to discuss the matter in more detail. What we did this morning was have staff go and respond to a number of comments that were made at the public hearing, as well as comments or responses to questions that were provided by council, I guess me. And we worked through this pretty thoroughly to a point where at the end we ended up having a committee recommendation to approve the annexation with one amendment, and that amendment has been passed out by staff to us.
No, that's
no. It should be in front of you.
Yeah.
And what it consists of is the situation in Area 27, which is at the intersection of Trickle Creek Road and Mount Baker Highway. It's a small area zoned commercial, and it had to do with whether or not to allow for drive-through establishments such as coffee houses. And what after taking a vote on an amendment to that, this was an extremely close vote. It only passed by one vote. The wishes of the committee were to have the drive-through exception provided. And with limitations, and the limitations were that it was the building size was to be no more than 2,500 square feet, and that there would be a one lane, and as it's proposed here, it would be a 10-foot lane for access to the drive-through, and that there would be interior seating in the establishment as part of this. And the language that shared those three items are included in this amendment. So with that, the committee's recommendation was to approve the annexation with this amendment, and I so move.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? It's the whole 9 yards now. Yes, sir.
So I said it before, I think our economic model for annexations is broken, but in this particular case, what I'm seeing is that in addition to that and separately, our financial impact methodology is also broken. The question before the council is, if we annex this area, what are the additional costs that we could incur? And in areas where significant capital investments are made in that area to serve that property, sometimes those costs are huge, 30, 40, 70 million in some certain cases. In this case, the capital costs are not that large at all, but there's an ongoing operational cost. But in conversations with our fire chief, our police chief, and our finance director, I've come to understand that we are doing our accounting, I think, the wrong way. What this report says is it would cost us approximately $7 million, 7.2, to accommodate new growth. But that's not true. It doesn't cost us $7.2 million in police and fire service to serve these 240 new residents in this part of town. It just simply says if the city grows this much citywide, that's what we will incur. We are trying to attribute the cost of this piece of straw as breaking the camel's back. I don't think this is a true, genuine cost accounting. Another way you might estimate this is what is the current per capita cost for police and fire service? We know that number. Multiply times the new residents, and you come up with an impact that's not $7 million. It was closer to, say, $2 or $2.5 million. It's quite a different figure. So I was prepared earlier to vote against this annexation as ridiculously expensive based on this financial analysis. My current opinion is this financial analysis is actually way overstates the costs, and this annexation is not only geographically appropriate, but I don't think it's going to be the boondoggle that the financial impact analysis says it was. So I'm going to support this, but I don't like the fact that our financial analysis is misleading to us. I want to make good decisions and not have to rely upon questionable assumptions in the model. I think there are ways of improving our financial impact analysis in the future.
Roxanne.
Well, I'm supportive of this annexation for a variety of reasons. I'll say them very briefly because we've been here a while. Simply put, we have to comply with the Growth Management Act in our city. And in order for us to do that, we have to find places where we can develop. We also do have a really big problem with housing in our community. We need housing that people can afford. Therefore, we need to build housing. This annexation would allow that. I ask people to also consider what happens when we build these homes and the people that live in them become taxpayers, when they spend money on our businesses, when they support our local community in the ways that we need to develop economically. So there is a cost at doing annexations, but there's also a tremendous benefit that we don't hear enough about in our city presentations, and that I hope our city presentations will include in the future, because we need to think long-term about the growth management of our area and about the well-being and the affordability of our housing.
Okay, any other discussion? Jack?
The more I think about what Michael said, he does make a very valid point about the financial modeling, and I look at what we do in terms of how we establish our park impact fee. That's based on pretty much a per capita basis as well, and it seems like it's more accurate in the way that it's not only applied in this particular financial model, but just how we deal with it, on a more macro basis. And I don't know. I support what you're saying, Michael. I would hope that that the council would consider working with staff to figure out a better way of dealing with financial models with future annexations next year sometime.
Okay. Motion been made and seconded. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. We will now go to Parks and Recreation. The chair is Roxanne Murphy.
We had one agenda item today, and it was a proposed ordinance for a smoking ban in parks. And so we had a good discussion today. There was a recommendation from the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board. We heard from our police chief, and we also heard from a member of our Parks Department. Basically, the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board is supportive of this, and specific community members are supportive of this. There were questions about enforcement and questions about cost. And I'd like to also turn it over to Jack to see what he would like to say, because this is his proposal, and I also understand that he may have an amendment.
Yes, thank you, Roxanne. The person in Parks was actually our interim Parks Director, Leslie Bryson. So this afternoon, I gave a bit of an explanation about why this is being brought forward, and for the most part, it's a situation. I think the last speaker that spoke to the issue kind of spelled it out, even though it was somewhat animated. I think he spelled it out in his comments pretty accurately, that there are a lot of families that come to parks expecting to have a safe, healthy experience, and that's not necessarily the case. And it's not just children, but it is also adults, it's seniors, it's people that have respiratory problems, and it's healthy people too. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I'm a healthy person, but I don't become healthy if I end up, breathing secondhand smoke. So this ordinance has more to do with establishing a ban on all city property, including parks and trails. It does not include sidewalks and streets, which are city property, but it's been exempted out. It does include electronic smoking devices, such as vape devices. And I brought forward the examples of what other cities in the state have been doing. What has been passed out before you by staff is a 2010 report about what other cities have done. What I passed out to you earlier today was an update to this 2010 report, which was from 2013. And in the 2013 report, it's basically double the sheet that you have here. And that report was produced by the Seattle-King County as an update in 2013. It was presented, I saw it as a presentation that was given to the City Parks Board 2 years ago when they were getting a presentation from the County Health Department. And they included that in there's a 12-page report on how to establish smoke-free parks in Whatcom County was the title of the report. It was about 12 pages. What I wanted to do was to condense it down into the handout I gave you this morning, or this afternoon. In talking with some council members and hearing some of the concerns that happened this afternoon, what I want to do is to, first of all, move the ordinance, because you haven't officially. Okay, so with your permission, I would move the ordinance forward. And I would like to add an amendment to that ordinance to say that, and I passed this out to you as well, and the amendment would have another section to it in the ordinance, and that would say, this ordinance shall be reviewed by council on December 31st, 2016 to determine whether future changes are warranted. And this provides an opportunity because a lot of the comments that we've been hearing are speculative. We don't know how it's going to work. We know how it works in other communities, and seems to be fine, but we don't know how it's going to work in Bellingham. But if the concern is that there's information that is outstanding that we just simply don't know, let's let it work for 1 year, get some good background on it, and then revisit it and see if it's the ordinance that we want. So with that, I would move the motion, or move the ordinance with this amendment.
So let's take the amendment first. So I second your amendment.
Okay.
And is there any council feedback? Dan.
So I did have some concerns around this proposed ordinance as relates to unfairly impacting people who are park users who are homeless, individuals who may be in the park for whatever reason because they don't have a home to be at. Smoking a cigarette, I don't want that person to go to jail for smoking. That's a consideration. There was some public comment here tonight about the jail. We know that measure did not pass, and so we have a lot of work to do in terms of how we handle our misdemeanors in the city of Bellingham. It is only with this amendment to the ordinance that I would consider supporting it, to check in 1 year to find out from our police and perhaps or even our community paramedic program and park workers and so forth, how does this process working? Are we indeed targeting, or are the impacts unduly being felt by people who are experiencing homelessness in our community? So with this check-in, I do feel, comfortable supporting this ordinance as it's stated.
Any other feedback?
I can support the amendment, but I think the overarching a resolution that it's under that I can't support is way too broad, and I won't. If we're just voting on the amendment but not the...
Well, we're going to vote on the amendment and then you vote on the entire.
Point of order?
That's how I understand Robert's.
Point of order? I think Jean should be calling the vote.
Yeah.
Okay, either way, that's the way it should go.
Okay, that's fine. She was doing all right.
You was.
That's okay. Yeah.
Trying to get it done.
Okay, the motion is on the amendment. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Now on the main motion. Is there any further discussion on the main motion? Does anybody, did you made the main motion already, haven't you? And you seconded, yes, okay. You got that, Elizabeth? Terry, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just think it's way too broad to to say enforcement of all the areas, the parks, all the trails, everything with it. I think it's overreaching. We don't need the rules. We have many of the issues already covered. We have the littering issues covered. I'd have no problem at all in looking at a ban around the play areas, and those kind of things. I think if we look at, Jack had said that the one list is an update, but if you look at the other policies, all these areas are not policies of no smoking on any city property. They are no smoking around playgrounds, signs around playgrounds. The majority of them are for specified areas within parks, not banning the whole park area. I still feel when we enact laws that we do not plan on, and the police chief has said that, we do not plan on enforcing, I think that we've got a problem. Because then when we set up laws that are important, it degrades those. People start thinking, you know, we're passing all these kind of laws to ban all their different parts of their life. And then when we set up stuff that's important, they look at it the same way. They don't care. This is, you know, they're not going to enforce this. This one, you know, it's just the city council making these laws again. And I've got problems with that. And so I can't support that. If it's specific, when Dr. Stearns talked about vapors, I agree. I don't support smoking. I wish we could get rid of most of the smoking. But if it's secondhand smoke along trails or whatever with the vapor, that's not the issue. It's about getting rid of smoking, which is a different issue than we're dealing with the parks. Let's be specific with what we want to get rid of. And so I can't support it this broad.
Okay. Michael.
I would note it's not actually a total prohibition against smoking in public parks. The mayor is authorized to designate smoking areas, which I think would be a wise policy to create a few limited areas which are away from ball fields and away from restrooms and away from playgrounds. I think we can reach a reasonable compromise in implementation. I'll be supporting the measure.
Okay.
Yeah, the other issue is the signage. They brought up signage. What kind of signage are we going to put on all the trails? From walking from downtown down to Boulevard Park, you know, there's no smoking. And there's different entry points. Are we going to sign those at each of those? Up around Lake Padden, all the entryways, are we going to put signs on all those areas and the entry trails that come into it? You know, we're creating something, but we're not saying how we're going to do it. So it's you know, I think we're creating something we don't need to. But I think it would be easy to say we don't want smoking around playgrounds or whatever, if it's a kids' area, and we would solve most of our problems.
Okay. Motion been made and seconded. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed?
Nay.
Motion carries 6-1. Councilman Borderman opposed. Thank you, Roxanne. Now we will go to Lake Whatcom Reservoir and Natural Resources Committee. Dan Hamill's the chair. Forgotten already, huh?
It's okay. Thank you. Thanks, Gene. See, today we had one item before us. This was a report out from the Lake Whatcom Policy Group meeting on November 2nd, and there were two items within the policy group's meeting. First item up was the Aquatic Invasive Species Prevention Program annual program review. Our local program, Bellingham program, started in 2012 as a voluntary education program for boaters at Lake Whatcom. The following year, about 3,200 boats were inspected at Lake Whatcom and Lake Sammamish, and between that year and this year, there's a threefold increase to 8,900 boats inspected. In 2015, annual permits for motorized boats are $50 and $20 for a 3-day pass. Non-motorized boats are charged a 10-day pass. About 6,000 people visited the webpage, and 2,837 people took and passed the online education course. And that provides a $10 off coupon against the cost of registration. For those non-motorized boaters, essentially, it's a cost-free registration for motorized boaters. About 30% participate in that program. Staffing for the program for the aquatic invasive species consists of 7 full-time equivalents, and the fee revenue is up $127,040 in 2014 to $136,960 in 2015. Total expenditures to date are $347,186. Additional investigation was conducted in 2015 regarding a separate aquatic invasive infestation. That's the Asian clam infestation in Lake Whatcom. There are 8 identified sites and 5 other possibilities. And next year, staff will evaluate the level of service offered by the program, such as when to start and end the inspections, in addition offering site inspections at Sudden Valley and community-based inspection events. One of the problems or issues that was brought up at the policy meeting was that for Lake Whatcom, we basically have 2 inspection points, one at the south end of the lake and one at Bullet Donovan, and there are 100 other points of entry on the lake that we don't regulate, or that's virtually impossible to regulate, and those are private launches. Some of them, not just in the city but in the county, are VRBO or Airbnb rentals that advertise, come launch your boat in our boat ramp into the lake. And so regulating that process has been challenging. Sheriff's Office has been contacted regarding enforcement trends, and I believe we'll see some numbers back on that in the next meeting or the meeting after. There was also discussion about restructuring fees to raise rates for higher risk boats, such as those registered in other states or jurisdictions, ones that come from different water bodies where there are infestations. Still working on that piece. There's a state invasive species council, and a funding advisory committee is looking into expanding inspection programs and revenues. The city has a representative on this committee, and will be providing an update coming back to committee at the next policy meeting. Second item up was the report on the homeowner incentive program, and that's a program to incentivize homeowners who live along the lake or in the watershed to essentially put in rain gardens and other types of mitigating programs within their yards and properties. And although there was a sort of a ramp down on funding, 82 new properties were interested in participating with 28 completed projects. These completed projects removed 2.2 pounds of phosphorus on an ongoing basis and infiltrated 1 million gallons of runoff during that process. Interesting point, in fact, I didn't bring this up this afternoon, but anyone on council know how much it cost for the homeowner incentive program per pound of phosphorus removed? Any ventures, any guesses? Anybody in the staff, or not Ted Carlson, but anyone else? Yeah, it's $43,000 to remove 1 pound of phosphorus. Michael Lillquist, you get the free pen tonight. You can have it. Program staff are engaged in evaluation of prior efforts and planning for a new version of this program, the HIP replacement program. The program is shifting towards targeting properties with higher or highest phosphorus removal potential, and owners of these properties that fall in this category were interviewed to understand what measures would be supported, and not surprisingly, people wanted to see additional monetary incentives. Policy group asked how the program monitored its results. The program uses calculated impacts of best management practices, or BMPs, from prior research with the application to the total maximum daily load model to provide expected local removal rates. So the next policy meeting will be on November 30th, 2015 at 2:30 p.m. City of Bellingham, Fireplace Room, Municipal Court Building, 625 Halleck Street. End of committee.
Thank you, Dan. The next committee is Finance and Personnel, chaired by Pinky Vargas.
We had one item in front of us today. We had the interlocal agreement between the Bellingham Housing Authority and the City of Bellingham. The city provides funding for a crime prevention officer who will work directly with the Bellingham Housing Authority staff and residents. This program has been in place since 2000 and includes both enforcement and preventative components focused on the Bellingham Housing Authority properties. The committee felt that this program works very effectively, and we unanimously recommended approval, and I so move.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, motion carries 7-0. Thank you. We will now go to Community Economic Development, chaired by Michael Lillquist.
Thank you, Gene. We had one item for us today was a discussion of possible paid sick leave program for Bellingham. The Bellingham City Council's Committee on Community Economic Development is currently considering the possibility of establishing rules for mandatory paid sick leave for employees at businesses located in Bellingham. No specific proposals under consideration at this time. The committee heard public comment regarding this idea on November 4th listening session. That was just last Wednesday. This afternoon, we summarized the range of thoughtful comments that we received at the meeting, and we left open the possibility of additional discussions or public meetings or public process and dialogue on this issue. The one action we did take is the committee unanimously made a motion to recommend tonight that the council draft a resolution supporting paid sick and safe leave as a state-level rule, and that the city takes an active advocacy role in Olympia pushing that idea forward. And so I would so move that the council endorse drafting such a resolution and taking that action.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0.
Thank you very much,
Michael.
end of committee.
Thank you, everybody. That, I think, will be on the agenda on the first meeting in December.
Yeah, the resolution will be coming back, and we'll discuss
Okay.
paid sick leave further then.
Okay. The next item is Committee of the Whole. We had several items. The first one is a resolution by the City Council of Bellingham, Washington, making a declaration of substantial need for the purposes of setting the limit factor of 2016 property tax levy. We discussed this afternoon, and the committee recommends approval, and I so move.
Second.
Roxanne, motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. The next item is an ordinance of the City of Bellingham, Washington, relating to the levying of taxes and establishing the amount to be raised in 2016 on the assessed valuation of the property within the city limits. This afternoon we discussed this. The committee recommends approval, and I so move.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. The next is a resolution setting the 2016 City Council meeting agenda, and the committee discussed this afternoon. The resolution fixed the times and dates for the 2016 regular meetings of the Bellingham City Council, beginning on January 4th, 2016. Committee recommends approval, and I so move.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. The next is a resolution regarding the Korean War Children's Memorial in the Big Rock Garden Park. This resolution will protect the Korean War's Children's Memorial Pavilion in the Big Rock Garden Park for future generations. The memorial has been dedicated to the American servicemen and women for their humanitarian aid to the children of Korea during the years 1950 to 1953 and beyond. And this afternoon, Terry made note of a change in the language on the 1, 2, 3rd whereas, where it should say, whereas the Korean War Children's Memorial at Big Rock Garden Park, and down below on the, now therefore be it resolved, the Big Rock Garden Park shall be protected and preserved by the City of Bellingham for future generations. And what was the Korean, you had, I wrote it down, the Korean War. Children, yeah. Korean War Children's Memorial. Yeah. And with those two changes, the committee unanimously recommends approval, and I so move.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Under older new business, we had an update from the mayor and Brian Heinrich on the, after the jail vote last Tuesday of meeting with the, on the county side with Sheriff Elfo and what's going to happen to that. I know there'll be a lot of future negotiations between now and the end of the year, so we'll be looking forward to more of that. We also had a budget work session in the mayor's boardroom. Those will be discussed next Monday. We do have a meeting next Monday night, and those will be discussed Monday afternoon.
Gene?
Yes.
Yeah, under old new business,
Oh,
I
I'm
just
sorry,
want to
sure.
mention again that next Monday morning, 8:30 a.m. on the corner of Laurel and Indian Street, we will be unveiling the new signs changing Indian Street to Billy Frank Jr. Street, and that'll be at 8:30 in the morning by the edge of Laurel Park.
Dan.
Also, next Monday, wanted to mention that Mayor Kelly and I both have the task force, the Reduction and Prevention Incarceration Task Force from 9 until 11. And so if there are any planning typically meets at 10:30, so I would just need to know that ahead of time to send a proxy or to perhaps move that meeting back by 45 minutes.
Okay. Anything else? Yes, Becky, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to let everybody know that the city is going to be hosting an energy fair tomorrow in our lobby from the hours from 11 to 2 p.m. And this is in support of the Georgetown University Energy Prize, and there'll be information from the utilities, from the Opportunity Council, and there'll also be discounted LEDs for people to purchase. So this is open to everyone, but we're encouraging city and county employees to come and participate, and we'd love to see you there. Thanks.
I think he'll sell you a light bulb. Okay. Yes, sir. Turn your mic on.
One is Elizabeth said that we still need to do minutes.
Oh, the evening minutes of the 26th. I'm sorry. We did the afternoon meetings. I'm sorry. The regular meeting minutes of the 26th of October.
I move approval of the meeting minutes of October 26th.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Yes, sir.
And then the other thing I wanted to talk about under old business, in today's Bellingham Herald, there was a report about, or an article in there about the waterfront and the granary building with the, or maybe this was over the weekend.
No, it was this morning.
This morning, okay. But in it, the architect for the granary building was quoted to say the developer meaning Harcourt, has a great interest in remodeling existing buildings. We think that the granary and the board mill will be bookends of the initial development. I take that comment with, man, it just hits me in the heart to go and think that our council was hoodwinked by a former staff at the port to think that the scorched earth policy of tearing down every single building on the waterfront except for the board mill and the granary was somehow sound planning process prior to even choosing the developer, which happened to want to go and do reuse of buildings. I'll point out once again that reusing a building is probably the best local thing that we can do for jobs in this community by taking a building and having our local laborers go and work on that building versus going and tearing it down, having all of that embodied energy destroyed, which is an environmental issue, but then going and mining other materials and manufacturing them in other places throughout the world using their labor instead of our labor, bringing it here and basically assembling buildings whenever they want to rebuild something in its place. We've destroyed some very, very good buildings, and we're still doing it now. And by the end of this year, we will have little to show for solid, reuse of buildings in the waterfront area. I'm happy that the granary was there and that managed to get saved. That's great. But it really, really pains me to see those other buildings come down the way that they have. It's just really sad.
Okay, we'll now go to the executive session report. We had 2 items. Labor Relations. Staff provided information on the ratification of the Bellingham Police Guild Collective Bargaining Agreement for 2014-2016. I will now entertain a motion to approve the agreement with the following general terms. Wages, 2% increase January 1st, 2014. January 1st, 2015, 2% increase. January 1st, 2016, 2% increase. Additional pay items are adjustments to special assignment pay, an increased officer in charge of hazardous devices and materials, 3%, increased canine master trainer to 6%, and added a SWAT sergeant premium of 3%. I will now entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Second item was Labor Relations. Staff provide information on the ratification of AFSCME 114 Collective Bargaining Agreement for 2015-2017. I will now entertain a motion to approve the agreement with the following general terms. 2% increase January 1st, 2015. 3% increase January 1st, 2016. 2% increase January 1st, 2017, and a 0.5% increase January 1st, 2017. And under the benefits, the 2015 employer and employee contributions will remain the same as implemented on the 1/1/2015 contract. In 2016, the employer contribution is capped at a 5% increase above the 2015 employer contribution to group health.
I move to approve.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Thanks to our collective bargaining team for their work. Mayor's report.
Thanks, Gene. That's what I was going to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on.
No, I said it in executive session, and I'll just say it out here in public, that I think they were faced with 9 unsettled contracts in January, and they've done a very good job of moving forward and working respectfully with our employees. So I just want to make that comment. Second, as the jail discussions with the sheriff have come forward, it would probably be good if we had a discussion about parameters as we're talking with him, so that you and I are on the same page. So I'll try to be putting something together with Brian and Peter and Brian that we can present to you, and then you can help fill out, make sure that we're talking about the same thing. It would be helpful to me when he shows up in my office. Fine. And then finally, I need approval for one mayoral appointment of Kathy Washakta to the Civil Service Commission.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, motion carries 7-0. Consent agenda.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, motion carries 7-0. The next meeting of the Bellingham City Council will be next Monday night, the 16th at 7 p.m. Meeting adjourned.